Ladies and gentlemen, there's an argument about animal suffering that you don't want to miss. I'm telling you, most people have never heard this argument as profoundly explained as my guest will be discussing this with you today. And we have Phil Halper joining us. Is it Halper? Halper?
Helper, yeah.
Halper, welcome to MythVision, my friend. This is our first discussion.
Thanks. It's great to be on. I've watched your show a lot, so it's a real honor to be on. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Thank you. I was watching this video that you have on your YouTube channel. First of all, I hope everyone will go subscribe to your YouTube channel. It will be in the description. You don't want to miss it. A lot of the stuff that you're talking about coming from an area that I'm not a specialist in, philosophical material that I usually do historical, archaeology, textual criticism, biblical, mythological. And yet I've been in trouble in the past with some of the pre-suppers in the world for not being philosophically aware of some of the arguments that are out there. But your YouTube channel and this particular video, Atheism's Best Argument, The Problem of Animal Suffering and Neuroscience of Pain, I will make sure that is in its own URL in the description. You can't miss this interview, this discussion. So Phil, where do we begin?
Well, let's begin thousands of years ago when the problem of evil was posed. Um, and of course, the problem is, if God is all powerful, he should be able to stop suffering. And if he's all good, then he should want to. So whence cometh evil is the phrase often quoted. And so that's an old problem. And Christians and other religions, they have responses to this. But what's new or newer is the problem of animal suffering, because a lot of the replies that particularly Christians give, like the fall, as an explanation for why there's so much suffering in the world, is not going to apply to animals. Um, so that problem of animal suffering has existed. And what we've done is publish a paper recently, which we call the expanded problem of animal suffering. And this is trying to argue that the problem is even worse than has already been described.
How would this be even worse? I mean, maybe Stillman how it was described, and then in what way could it get any worse?
Right. So the typical example that's given for the problem of animal suffering goes back to a paper by William Rowe, who's a famous philosopher, and he presented this argument where the example was a deer. It was actually a fawn, so baby deer, is dying in a forest. I guess I think it was a lightning strike, caught in a fire, and is sort of dying slowly. And he's like, "Come on, this is just pointless suffering. No good God would allow this." Um, so now his version of it is more specifically, this is evidence against God. So probably God doesn't exist, given this sort of suffering. Um, Now, what's also been pointed out is, the evolutionary process is very, very violent. So you may be aware that some Christians, for example, will say, yes, we accept evolution. God just chose evolution as the means to get to us. But so we can happily accept evolution and accept the tenets of our faith. But of course, the problem is that evolution is extremely violent. So it doesn't really look like the sort of thing that a good God would create. So the typical literature talks about these sorts of examples. Why did God make such a violent evolutionary process? Why is there animal suffering, like the example given by Rowe? But what we say is that no, 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 it's much, much worse than that. So what we do is highlight sort of 5 problems that the theist has to tackle. So quickly, they are the problem of time, and this is the fact there's been hundreds of millions of years of animal suffering before humans ever existed. So if you're going to take a reply to the problem of suffering, which is, oh, it's all down to human sin, then that's not really going to work. And in fact, the Christians didn't know about this. No one knew about this until quite recently. Last 200 years maybe, that we've sort of known about this. Um, So that's a problem. So that's problem number one. Problem number two is the one we described. Why use such violent processes? And these, philosophers will talk about these sorts of things. But what you never seem to hear, or very rarely at least, is that there's also a problem of animal suffering in terms of the Bible. So we call this the problem of divine commands and the problem of divine actions. So these are two additional problems. So the divine commands are where God commands cruelty to animals. So um, a good example is the story of Joshua in Joshua 11:6, and God is giving sort of battle tactics to the Hebrew armies, and He says, "Hoff their horses." And I remember reading that, thinking, "What does hoff the horses mean?" There's some translation, Derek, right? Go on, tell us.
No, no, no. Yeah, I was just thinking of this whole idea of what in my mind, the reason I raised my hand, I'm thinking, why do this to the animals? Like, what do they do to you? I get the man, but like, what's the horse gonna do? Walk into your camp at night?
It's clearly a battle tactic, right? I mean, the enemy are coming at you with horses, maybe chariots, um, so the idea is to sort of take out what would be the equivalent of a tank in ancient warfare. But, I actually spoke to a friend of mine recently. Actually, it wasn't a friend, it was my nephew, and he's into ancient history, and he was saying, "Oh, no, there's many other strategies they could have adopted. Pushing the soldiers off the horse would be, another strategy they could have adopted." But the point is God is omnipotent, so he could have just, like, tranquilized the horses. He could have teleported them off the battlefield. He could have made them run away. He could have done so many different things, but instead he commanded them to hoff a horse. And now we should explain what hoff a horse is. It's to sever the Achilles tendon of the horse. Absolutely horrendous torture to the animal. Um, so this is the sort of thing that God commands. I mean, there's other examples. Go and kill all the Amalekites. Now, when you look at the discussion of the Amalekite slaughter, if you look at someone, famous theologian William Lane Craig, if you look at the sort of defenses he gives, how can this be justified? They're literally commanded to kill all of the men, women, and children of the Amalekites. And he'll say things like, well, the adults deserved it because they were sinful and evil, and the children, they get to go to heaven, so no problems. But what he misses is the fact that it says kill all the animals as well. Um, Another example in Deuteronomy, we're told that if a town is to encourage its members to worship other gods, then you should investigate very carefully. And if you found that it's true that they have encouraged the townsfolk to worship other gods, you got to kill them all, including their animals. So, and of course, we have the animal sacrifices in the temple period. So, there's a lot of divine commands, which look like horrendous cruelty to animals. And then you have these what we call divine actions, where God is directly cruel to animals. So the Great Flood, the 10 plagues. Now, a lot of people, they'll know that the 10th plague was to kill all the firstborn. They might not know that it's also killing all the firstborn domestic animals as well. Um, and the first plague is, all the fish drown because the water in the Nile's turned to blood. Um, so and of course, you might think, well, that's the cruel Old Testament God, Jesus, would surely never be cruel to animals. But indeed, in the story of Legion, he exorcises demons into 2,000 pigs that then run off a cliff and drown. So, so that basically the Christian then has to contend with this. They've got to come up with explanations that can cover all of these problems. And then we also have a last problem. We call it the problem of the Anthropocene. So right now, there appears to be a sort of mass extinction event going on. So if paleontologists of the future were to look back at our era, the human era, they would see all these species going extinct. It would be very similar to looking at, the KT boundary where the dinosaurs got wiped out. And the reason for this is predominantly human consumption of meat. Um, and God would surely know this, and he could have avoided it by making us herbivores, or even just encourage us to eat less meat or no meat. He could have put yeah, in fact, a little tweak might be there was recently discovered a genetic predisposition that some people have when they try and go vegan, they find it more difficult than others. Well, God could have switched that gene off, or the clusters of genes. So he could surely have done this, and they can't argue that God wouldn't interfere with our free will on diets because, he gives commands about diets. So these are the 5 problems: the problem of time, the problem of creation, the problem of divine actions, problem of divine commands, and the problem of the Anthropos.
Look, there's so many layers to this. I think I practice philosophy all the time without realizing like that's actually what I do all the time. So when I hear people talk about you don't study philosophy, I don't use their language. I don't study a lot of the stuff they're talking about. But as soon as you started talking about a text that describes cutting the Achilles on the horses or killing the animals, which by the way, Samuel the prophet approaches, he hears animals. That's how he finds out. Why didn't you kill every man, woman, and child and the animals? So the animals are the reason he knew that Saul didn't accomplish what God commanded. So here you have all of this textual data that implies he does not care, not only for the people, which is pretty cruel, but also the animals is implied, at least when you're reading this, the way he wants them annihilated. But, I like to step back and go, isn't this all just complete evidence that we're dealing with the perception of these ancient writers and what they thought? And so they're just crafting up stories or giving, if there is any historical memory to any of this stuff, giving just this archaic idea of the world. It's clearly just man-made. But when you're playing with or in conversation with these theistic Christians and such, you almost have to get your hands dirty, get into the world in which they're living, and try to navigate these kinda ideas like you're talking about. We could just throw it out and go, "Yeah, this is legend or myth. This never happened," which is an easy way of solving it because I do think a lot of that is the case. But you have to get your hands dirty. What do you do with the swine that jump off the cliff and drown when Jesus is the one treating the demons more favorably than the swine itself? And what do Christians do? And there's various tactics, and you know this better than I do. Can you run us through? I mean, one of them I know Augustine kind of just goes based on his reading of Jesus in this story, because one can look at the Old Testament, even the Christians that were dealing with their debates with Gnostics. Gnostics saw this God, and many, and I'm just not trying to blanket all Gnostics in the same umbrella here, but many of them saw this God as evil and wicked. This creator was not the good father of Jesus, but they still could see this really vindictive Hebrew scripture material. And yet you get Augustine reading Jesus doing this to swine and going, well, it's apparent that the Lord himself shows that animals aren't, we can do whatever. We don't have this view of animals. Now you have apologetics built, finding ways to make up stuff about animals like they don't feel pain like we do, or all of these excuses.
Yeah. Yeah, well, it's funny you mentioned the Samuel, because of course, what happens to Saul, I mean, not all of your viewers know, probably some of them do, is that of course God is unhappy that Saul didn't kill all the animals. He was commanded to, but he left some alive, and for that, God was upset. Um, so yeah, so this is a really big problem for the theist, and I agree. Gnosticism makes more sense of it because they basically just go, yeah, of course the Old Testament God is evil. So to me, Gnosticism makes a lot more sense. And it's funny. My friend Alex O'Connor, he's been pushing Gnosticism, and if you watch the video where when he interviewed Bart Ehrman, he actually says, and the reason I got into this is because my friend Phil Halper told me about it over dinner one time, and he just couldn't believe it. He wanted to run home and start reading the Gospel of Judas because these have got amazing ideas in them. So I do agree, Gnosticism makes a lot more sense. But I mean, obviously, we don't have all of the Gnostic texts, and we've recovered the Gospel of Judas. But um, so who knows what they thought about the story of Legion? I don't know if that would be a story that the Gnostics would have accepted as part of their text. But certainly, Jesus is not immune from cruelty to animals. So although it's not as severe as the Old Testament, it's still there. So they have to deal with that. So yeah, they have a whole bunch of different strategies. Maybe we can go through them one by one, but the most obvious one is that animals don't feel pain. If that's true, then God's off the hook. So and it's amazing how many theologians have actually pushed this from, um, Augustine. I don't know if he actually says they don't feel pain, but he says they don't matter. Whether they felt pain and who cares, or whether he felt they just don't feel pain. I think probably it was the latter, but he doesn't explicitly say it. But the idea goes back to Aristotle, actually. So Aristotle had this view of like different types of souls. So one type of soul is called the rational soul. So this is like your ability to reason. And the view was that animals don't have the rational soul. And so I think Christian writers like Augustine, Thomas Aquinas, and others said, well, animals don't have the rational soul, so therefore we don't really care about their pain and suffering. It's just not part of the picture. They're not going to heaven. They don't have, a soul that really matters to us. So that was the view, and it goes all the way back to the birth of to very early Christianity. Um, but then Descartes sort of revived it. I think he faced this problem, and he said that animals are just like clockwork machines. So they respond, when you prod them, but there's no soul inside that can really feel pain. So followers of Descartes, like Mellenbranch, were said to, kick a pregnant dog and do like live vivisections on animals without, I mean, just horrendous stuff because they're like, well, animals don't suffer. So that's called the Cartesian view. And then what happened was in the 20th century, this view got sort of revived, but it's called neo-Cartesianism. So it's a slightly different version. It doesn't claim that animals have no consciousness, which is what Descartes said. Um, but rather it says that their pain doesn't matter. So they could be conscious and sentient, but their pain doesn't matter. And there could be sort of two reasons for that. So one is that they're either like not self-aware enough for it to matter, or two, they don't have what's called affect. So that's affect with an A. And affect is what the sort of term neuroscientists use when they talk about the emotional content of some experience. So if you have negative affect, that's basically an experience that you have that you don't like. So the claim would be either animals are not self-aware or they don't experience negative affect. Um, so that was this view was pushed by C.S. Lewis, amazingly, like the author of Narnia and all those talking animals that you care for in the story. He actually said, "Nope, you know, animals don't really feel pain." And in fact, he said something like, "From the I don't know if this is the exact quote, but it's either this or something very like it." He said, "From the doctrine that God is good, we may confidently deduce that animal pain is an illusion." And I think that's right, actually. If there is a good God, then really there shouldn't be any animal pain. So if we see that they are in pain, I guess it must be an illusion. But we can just flip his argument around. If we've got good evidence that animals are in pain and do experience pain, then it should be that God doesn't exist, or at least he's not. When we say God doesn't exist, we mean the omni-God, the perfectly good, loving, all-powerful God. Um, we can flip his argument around. And so recently that's got revived. This neo-Cartesian argument has been revived by there was a guy called Michael Murray, and then William Lane Craig, very, very well-known apologist, sort of copied Murray, but he didn't do it quite accurately, if you want to go into the details. But he kind of got it a little bit wrong. But he basically copied Murray and said, yeah, animals don't really feel pain or they're not aware of their pain. And he said on his website, you know, this these incredible insights that animals don't feel pain show that God has been, this remarkable he's taken remarkable care of creation, and we should praise him for this incredible thing that he's done to all the animals. But of course, again, we can flip his argument around. If it turns out that it's false that they don't feel pain or they're not self-aware, then not only should God not be praised, but he should be condemned, Um, so that's basically the argument there. And shall I go into like our investigations as to how we think we've proved that it's wrong?
Yeah, I think that's worth doing because I think you just set up the dilemma here. If they really do feel pain like we feel pain, they experience suffering like we experience suffering, and C.S. Lewis, Augustine, Descartes, all of these people who dismiss it or say it doesn't really count, or they aren't feeling pain, depending on the various different interpretations that some of these people have, because I think they saw this problem, at least to some degree, in some manner of their philosophizing the world. And I've even heard Capturing Christianity, Cameron Bertuzzi made a post somewhere. I saw it and I like, I eavesdrop every once in a while and see stuff. And it was something like, thank God the animals don't feel suffering. And I can't tell you how many times in my feed I see a zebra's face being ripped off by a crocodile and like the things that I see. And I think to myself, Why? What the hell is that?" And you just dismiss it's so interesting what apologetics, in my view, can do and how far we can go in trying to make our worldview right to try and fit this stuff. So, yeah, take us into the arguments. I can see the problem because if they are feeling what we feel, well, then we need to know how are we gonna make sense of that? And I'm sure there's gonna be a billion excuses to keep the empire up of our worldview when it comes to Christianity.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of Christians recognize this as a really powerful argument against God. And that's just the evolutionary bit of the argument without even considering, the divine commands, divine actions, and so on. So, yeah, they kind of need to come up with something, right? So, yeah, Richard Swinburne, actually another famous Christian philosopher, has made a very similar argument. So, what they try and do is to highlight some part of the brain that does something like pain processing or self-awareness. And they say, animals don't have that. So back in Descartes' time, he focused on the pineal gland, but that was, not taken, can't be taken very seriously today. So what the contemporary, what we call the neo-Cartesians often say, they appeal to some part of the cortex, and in particular, the prefrontal cortex. So this is a bit of the brain that they claim either does pain affect or does self-awareness. So William Lane Craig famously said in a debate with Stephen Law that animals don't aren't aware of their pain because they don't have a prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex is what you need for self-awareness. And so animals aren't aware that they're in pain. So what happened was, and in fact, Richard Swinburne and this other really famous philosopher, Christian philosopher, I think he would focus more on the anterior cingulate cortex, and it's another part of the cortex. The cortex is a bit of the brain that does more higher function, so more like thinking and cognitive stuff. So what happened was, we found a patient that had all these regions destroyed. So we could actually experimentally test what a Christian philosopher says. How many times do you get to hear that sentence?
Not yeah, that's a powerful, like, falsifiable way of verifying what you're doing to show whether or not they feel are they actually and I don't wanna jump ahead. I did, interview Mark Selms?
Soames, yeah, he's very good, yeah.
Yeah, I interviewed him on consciousness, and he goes into examples like you're talking about because I guess previous models of consciousness that were trying to be explained, they were doing the same thing where they were going, "Oh, it's the prefrontal cortex, or it's midbrain, or it's this, or it's that." And he went into this because his brother fell off a two-story building, and it changed him forever. He didn't act or even seem to be the same person, so much changed in terms of his brain physiology that it like sparked Mark to go down this path and found people who were missing all of their cortex, front, back, the whole nine, and still had consciousness to some degree. So it's just really interesting. I don't know all the science, but please,
Yeah, no, Marx is an excellent book with a hidden spring,
yeah,
and he's very much in line with what we say, in that he basically thinks that consciousness, self-awareness is this sort of thing. It's coming from what's called subcortical regions. And the important part here for the religious debate is that these are evolutionary ancient. So what the theologians like William Lane Craig are trying to argue is that no, no, it's all going on in the prefrontal cortex, which is more modern. Like, I say modern, it's still like tens of millions of years old. Well, I mean, like, the claim is that they're in primates, and primates go back tens of millions of years, but it wouldn't be hundreds of millions of years. So it would, it would make the problem a little bit better. It would still be pretty bad, but it would make it slightly better. I guess they want to chip away at it one bit at a time. But what we found was that we had this patient. It's called patient R, and he had his prefrontal cortex like obliterated, and his anterior cingulate cortex. So what my colleagues did was test his self awareness, and it was perfectly intact. So the claim that you need a prefrontal cortex for self-awareness is falsified, and you only need one example because the claim was this is necessary. So if you said, well, it makes it more likely, then you'd have to do statistics on people with, people without. But if you claim it's necessary, then you only need one case to disprove that, and that was the claim that they made. It was necessary for self-awareness. So because Roger has self-awareness, um, and doesn't have a prefrontal cortex, then we can literally falsify Craig's claim. But it gets worse than that because what happened after they tested his self awareness, they went back and tested his pain perception because the the claim is, if it's maybe if it's to do with affect, maybe it would be reduced with Roger because there's so much damage to his cortical regions. And it's true that the anterior cingulate cortex does light up when people are studied in emotional pain. So the claim might be, well, to have that emotional component of pain, the affect, you need the anterior cingulate cortex, and we know that from brain scans because it lights up. But there's an alternative explanation, which is, I mean, there's probably more than one alternative explanation, but one alternative explanation is that it lights up because actually it's trying to control the pain. In which case, if you don't have it, it would be worse, not better. So with Roger, they tested him and his pain was much worse than baseline. So they don't torture the guy. They have this protocol where you put your hand in a bucket of water, cold. It's basically a freezing temperature, but it's stirred to stop it from actually solidifying. And then you're asked, well, you take it out whenever you like. It's up to you how much you can tolerate. So try and tolerate as much as you can, but the choice is yours. You put it out whenever you want. And he was hypopathic to pain, which means he's much worse than baseline. And in fact, they tried to scan him, but they couldn't because scan someone in an MRI, you need to keep quite still, and he couldn't keep still whilst doing this test. So they actually couldn't get a good brain scan out of him. But the point was he was hypopathic, which using their argument would imply animal pain is worse than human pain. Now, it's not totally definitive because there are other explanations, but the bottom line is, the really important part is that this just cannot be necessary for pain. And so it must be the case that other regions of the brain, not cortical regions, are doing the pain, likely subcortical regions, as Mark Soames would argue and has argued very forcefully in his book Hidden Spring. So our results were very much confirmatory of that. And what this does is it completely blows the arguments out from William Lane Craig, from Michael Murray, from Richard Swinburne. They're all sort of appealing to these cortical regions. And the history of this is that, a few decades ago, it was thought that the cortical regions were kind of key components to consciousness and self-awareness. So that's presumably why these philosophers who are, let's see, they're all in their 70s, well, I think William Lane Craig is, and how old is Richard Swinburne now? I mean, they're old, right? So they would have been at the height of their careers, many decades ago, when it was the case that the cortex was seen as the seat of consciousness. But now the evidence, I think, is much, much stronger that it's not in the cortex. I mean, even if it was in the cortex, all mammals have a cortex, right? So, I mean, one thing Craig said was that, only higher primates have a prefrontal cortex. That's just false. I mean, that's just wrong. Uh, there are some old versions of the way that it could be defined, but even that would still include all primates. But the standard definition would include all mammals. But if we go with this subcortical idea, then we're talking like it's widespread throughout the animal kingdom. And now there's even people saying maybe even insects as well. So this makes the problem of animal suffering much, much, much worse than the Christians ever imagined, and we have experimental data that really destroys the claims of these Christian apologists. Although I should say that one of them was just contradictory because, um, Craig said that one of the reasons they sort of appealed to this was that in the 1950s, there was a procedure called a lobotomy, which severed the prefrontal cortex. And, the claim was that people that had lobotomies didn't mind their pain. And so Murray used this, and other philosophers have used this as well to sort of say, well, you could have pain that you don't care about or something like that. But actually, when we dug up, what we did in our paper was sort of dig up the original case reports, and we found it wasn't true that they didn't mind their pain. What was true was that their anxiety about their chronic pain was reduced. But chronic pain is sort of pain you get for months and months and months. You know, it's long term pain, and you can imagine someone being very concerned about it. You know, what would it mean for your health if your chronic pain is getting worse? So anxiety about the future was reduced from the prefrontal cortex, but acute pain, which is the sort of sudden pain that you get in a quick case, like putting your hand on a stove, that was just as bad, if not worse, as before. Um, so it wasn't true, but the contradiction lies in they were relying on the patients telling them about their pain. Now, if it was the case that the prefrontal cortex was needed for pain awareness, for self-awareness, sorry, um, how could it be that they report on their pain? Wouldn't the patient have to be aware in order to report on their pain?
Right.
So they're literally these Christian theologians are just contradicting themselves. I mean, this is a simple contradiction. If it's needed for self-awareness, then they shouldn't be able to report on their pain, but yet you're relying on these reports of their pain. I mean, it was just insanely contradictory.
So to take what you've said so far, really the whole point is to show that taking in factoring the fact that we evolved and that we're part of the animal kingdom, we're all connected here. And we like to act in this conversation that we're like completely distinct, as if we didn't also come from and rise out of the same pool of life that is on this planet. When you take this argument and you apply it to its scientific, rigorous conclusion, I almost want to use the word lizard brain. Marx Sohm was describing the brain stem, and areas down in the brain stem is really where this is all kind of happening in that region, which is like the lowest, oldest evolutionary product. If we're using a machine and imagining the engine, pretend today we have these engines that have all this stuff, but like let's just imagine it's a bad analogy, but the analogy is there that there's like the most basic fundamental engine that we used at one point. It, it worked. It just wasn't as heightened and as manufactured as we have today. It didn't work as well as it does today. We have all these components that make it even better. But even in the basic motor, that lizard brain, if I can use the term, that goes hundreds of millions of years ago, um, in that we feel pain. And if we can use that, recognizing that there's pain even in creatures of life that have this some type of product of that that allows them to experience these things, and we experience pain, and we're able to then look at that and go, hold on, how long has life suffered? Because once you look at evolution and you realize how much death is literally part of it, and it's necessary that things die and go extinct and suffer in order for any of this to be that we're in right now. Who set up this system? And why would they do something like that if you then turn around and use an adjective that we would say, or title it as good? Like, we wouldn't look at any human on earth that created an environment or set up some type of ecosystem that did all of this and decided, I think I'm going to create a hypothetical ecosystem where I'm going to have this cannibalize this. Oh, and by the way, that species won't live unless it hurts this species and literally digest and eats and picks them apart. Now, imagine that he'd be a little more benevolent if he said, okay, immediately as soon as the teeth fangs come in, they feel no pain and they shut off instantly and they
Yeah, well,
shut.
there's a really good example actually, because I got bitten by not was bite the right word? I got a leech on my leg when I was in Malaysia one time, and, we were out hiking in a forest, and, I didn't feel a thing, and I'm not quite sure if the physiology is right here, but I believe it has some kind of anesthetic, Um, but if that's true or not, what the bottom line is, it sucked my blood and I didn't feel anything. Now, it could be the case that predators have anesthetics in their teeth. God could have done that, but he didn't. Why not? Or he could have made it such that animals just absorb energy from the sun, so you wouldn't even need to have predators. You know, he could have done all kinds of things that would have reduced the suffering of animals. One of the cases that we give, that we like, is what's called a predator trap. Do you know what a predator trap is? Okay, so it's a scenario where there's some sort of sticky material like tar or something, and an animal gets stuck, and they basically can't move and they starve to death. And that's horrific in itself. And you could imagine, why couldn't God just have given animals the instinct to avoid these predator traps? But it's much, much worse than that, because what happens is, once one animal gets stuck, a predator comes in and goes, "Ah, easy meal." So they go in for the kill and they get stuck too. And at the La Brea tar pits in California, there are the remains of 4,000 predators that were killed in this predator trap, just stuck in this. And God could have easily just given them an instinct to avoid it. I mean, animals have instincts to avoid fire, right? So you can imagine there was a small tweak, and all those lives, all that horrendous suffering would have been avoided. Um, so why didn't he? Um, and of course, one of the biggest ones is the suffering that we inflict upon animals, the horrendous factory farms and so on. And God would know this is coming. He can see the future. So why wouldn't he sort of, you know, command us not to eat meat, or reduce the meat intake, or make it impossible for us to eat meat? I mean, we can have perfectly healthy diets without meat. And the thing about the story of Legion that I find so fascinating is that not only did Augustine interpret it as saying, "Well, this proves that animals have no moral worth," um, God would know about Augustine's interpretation, and he would know how influential it would be, because Thomas Aquinas said the same thing. So, the idea that, I mean, Catholic people, when people suggested prayers for animals, the Catholics rejected it, saying it's absurd, you know, um, because we know animals don't have the rational soul. Go back to Aquinas and Augustine. God knows that these interpretations are going to be there, and he could have maybe not put the demons into 2,000 pigs, so that Augustine would interpret this as having animals, as animals not having worth. But yeah, he didn't. So again, what's the best explanation for this? Best explanation, I think, is that this is a text from ancient people and not from a perfectly good God.
That seems to be the obvious no-brainer for me, and then factoring in some of the theological interpretations Christians will lay over the text, "We're made in the image of God." Depending on who you read, what that means, we would almost have intuitions of goodness like God. If you take the kind of more later anachronistic interpretations and lay it back onto the text, our intrinsic value is worth more, or all of these different things. But I'm thinking to myself, it was your God, according to Genesis 6 through 9, where Noah's flood takes place. And after the flood, after he does this universally, wild annihilation and extinction, so to speak, of life on Earth, if you take it globally, I know that many Christians go, "Well, we don't think this was globally. We think it was only meant to be locally." And even Alex was saying in the video in yours that you had, where he's like, "I don't think this was meant to be taken literal. I think it is an etiology of some sort." At the same time, suppose know that notice the mountain that the boat lands on in the Noah case, right? Would the other myths have them land on different mountains as well? But uh, you kind of wonder, like today, when you get a young Earth creationist who finds seashells at the top of a mountain, they need to explain how that is. So maybe someone saw on Mount Ararat seashells or some type of sea life and thought, okay, there must have been a flood, and then they, in some ideological way of mythology, the same reason that women have pain in childbirth. I know, because they told us to eat the fruit first, or they are the reason we fell. Like, there's always some mythical origin for these things. And that might be somewhat of the reasoning behind this Ararat scene. I don't know. But to the point, Noah gets off the boat after dry land appears again. He starts cooking up an animal. one of the animals he had on the ark that he saved their life for this purpose. So it's not like he's saving their life because he cares about animals like that. Um, and then he's cooking a barbecue. God smells the barbecue and it changes his mind. So because of the scent of the animal, he then and this goes way back into Mesopotamia with Enlil. Enlil had the same repentance of he was angry. "Who the hell kept them alive? One of you," and he immediately starts blaming Enki or Ea, the trickster deity, for telling mankind about the flood that they swore a pact they would never tell humans that they're gonna flood them. And what does Enki do? He goes to a reed wall and goes, "Oh, reed wall," knowing that, Utnapishtim's listening. "Reed wall, warning, reed wall, there's a flood coming." Well, Enlil at the end smells this, and all the gods are like, "How could you kill all the humans we have as slaves for us that are laboring to bring us food?" Smell that? And they, "Oh, I'm never doing that again." Well, the biblical God literally echoes the same sentiments going, "I promise I will never flood." So it's all like based in cooking the flesh of an animal that this God is appeased in the mindset of the author. And I remember I got in trouble with John J. Collins one time. I was interviewing him and I said, "Well, God says here, and God said there in the text, thus saith the Lord, thus saith the Lord." He goes, "God never said nothing." And I'm like, "But he says that God never said anything, Derek. The author wrote that God said, but God didn't say anything." And I was like, "Oh, wow, it's such a good criticism to have. Like, stop just accepting what this text says, even as a non-believer now, and start realizing like these are ancient authors clearly, but what Christians need to do, even the orthodox ones who want to act like scripture is not our primary source of authority, they still wrestle with this same exact problem and they can't escape. Why would a loving, benevolent deity do this? Oh, animals don't feel suffering, or they don't have souls, or they don't really matter. And that's what kind of earth will we if everyone became Christian with that mentality, what kind of planet would we have? Like, what would end up occurring?
Well, I think we can see what's going on now is, mass extinction. This is what's happening to other species. And it's interesting that you point out the story of the flood and its origins in Mesopotamia. But I've always understood, and maybe you can correct me if I get this wrong, but my understanding is in the Sumerian version of the flood myth, the flood is sent because humans are noisy.
Yes.
And the gods, right, okay, good. Now that the gods want to rest. So that kind of makes a bit of sense. Um, the the notion that the flood is sent because humans are sinful makes absolutely no sense. Um, because then why is he killing all the animals, But also the sin is still there afterwards. Everything that was there before the flood is there afterwards. So obviously in reduced numbers, but they saved every species apparently. So it makes absolutely no sense. The only way to make sense of it is that yeah, this was copied from a Mesopotamian and they basically adapted it to their own theology. Um, but one thing I want to point out is that, there are obviously a lot of Christians that don't take these to be literal. And this was pointed out, Inspiring Philosophy did a video review of that. I did a debate recently. It was a 2-on-2 debate. Alex O'Connor and myself versus the Connectleys, the famous street university campus preachers. And so I pointed out some things in the Bible and Inspiring Philosophy was, oh, well, we don't believe that's literal. To me, it's like, it doesn't matter whether you think it's literal. That's not the point. The point is how the author understands the action of the God, right? It's clear that the text is endorsing that as a righteous action. Whether they think it happened or not is not really the point. You know, it's the moral message that comes through. So that when Augustine interprets the story of Legion and says it implies that animals don't matter, like Augustine's right. It does imply that. Okay. But, the alternative is to say, well, but this isn't written, by anyone other than a cruel culture. So the better interpretation is to say we reject the moral message of the text, we can do that without, thinking it's historically accurate.
Yeah, really odd that inspiring philosophy will recognize Genesis seems to be very mythic. And I feel like it's hard to pin him down on what he's really doing because he wants to be sophisticated and, run in the crowds of the upper echelon of academia by he's one of the cherry picking kings that I've ever ran into when it comes to quote mining an academic. He'll take I don't know, if a scholar's written 5,000 words in books in his life, he'll find a sentence that supports what he says or wants and then ignore all 4,998 words. I'm just making up a number here. Like, he does this. And here I am catching him go, flood. We don't think that's literal. Or if you pin him down, do you think that's literal or something happened? Well, okay, it's a local flood. Oh, okay. So you do think there's historically a local flood, even though we have these Mesopotamian. What are you then going to say? Is that what do you do with the polytheistic ancient Mesopotamian, clearly older story that would have inspired these later Noah creation accounts, Tower of Babel scenes, genealogies, all of that from the Sumerian kings list, and the list goes on and on. Maybe he'll go, "Okay, okay, okay, I'll grant all that. That never happened." Your point still stands about what is the lesson? What is the picture here? But then when you go to other places like the Exodus, the conquest, when you start going to these other horrific places, he doubles down. Him and David Falk, who's an Egyptologist, wanna, historicize the whole thing as if it actually happened, but then he's willing to go, okay, millions didn't leave Egypt. So these numbers are hyperbolic, or there's particular they will do this strange apologetics to make sure that there was a literal conquest. There had to have been slaughtering, but of course, we don't take it so literal that there's 2, 3 million, however many Israelites leave Egypt or whatever. And it's a strange N hearing it happen, like, he does want these things to have happened. He defends the validity of what's going on or the veracity of the scriptures as if it's historical, and he does this, I think, as a Catholic, but then he gets to New Testament material, and he's even more defensive about this happened. He even entertains Lydia McGrew, like, I do not know, that's very fundamentalist type material.
Oh, yeah,
Did
if you wanna see a really good, reply to Lydia McGrew, check out my friend John Nelson and, Josh Parrick. They've done excellent replies to Lydia McGrew, and they're Christians. John actually is how I knew Alex O'Connor. He's a Christian scholar, New Testament expert, and, he's really done a great job, him and Josh, of taking down the undesigned coincidences argument. So I'd highly recommend that. But yeah, now coming back onto IP, uh, sorry, inspiring philosophy. Yeah, I mean, I believe that he believes the Exodus happened, right? So that's plenty of cases of cruelty to animals in there. As we said, the fish drowned in the first plague. There's the plague of boils. There's the cattle being killed in another plague, and in the last plague, the um, the firstborn, all the firstborn domestic Egyptian animals are killed. And then, of course, when they chase after them with their chariots, God sends the waters. And, of course, all the horses would have been drowned as well. So, God is omnipotent. He could have just uh, turned the horses around. He could have just hypnotized them to change direction. He did not need to drown them all, right? Um, so,
what real quick on that, how many times have you heard the Christians when you bring up slavery? Because they have a funny way of dealing with slavery. The same way you're talking about animal suffering, they do this stuff about slavery and they make up stuff to try and act like this is different, and they do all that. You notice a common trend. Almost anything horrific or bad, they'll find a way to navigate it so that their God doesn't become the culprit. And I find that odd that they'll constantly go, but what do you do when he frees them? He's not for slavery. He is freeing them from Egypt. He is the God who is actually making them come out of bondage. And we heard Martin Luther King Jr. actually quote this coming out. And I'm like, have you read your Bible? Because the very God of the Bible, according to Genesis, puts them into slavery. He tells them, I'm going to put you into slavery in Egypt. and then it's 400 plus years later that they get freed from bondage. So when you hear the Connecals or you hear like various different Wes Huff, if you ever hear inspiring philosophy, this idea, I don't know any of them, any apologists that act like God's not, this is without getting into the Exodus or getting into Deuteronomy or Leviticus and the law codes, just generally in the story, the whole reason Israel is in bondage in Egypt, according to the narrative, is that God is going to put them there so that 400 plus years later, too bad for the people in between that who died, who were slaves and in bondage and suffering and stuff like that. Then he'll free them to show his power and his might.
Well, yeah, yeah. So this gets us on to another way that Christians have tried to reply to the problem of suffering or animal suffering in particular. And there's this thing called skeptical theism, where the idea is a bit of a weird name. It's not skepticism of theism. It's skepticism that we can know what would be good, if you like, the whole arc of history. So when we look at something that appears to be bad, we can't conclude that it actually is bad because we don't have what they say is epistemic access to all the relevant consequences of these actions. So we don't know, God, we're going to assume if we're theists that God has a good reason for all this, but we don't know. We'll just say, look, we don't know what it is because we're not smart enough to know. We're like, the amateur chess player playing against the grandmaster who makes a weird move, and you don't understand why they sacrifice their queen. But trust me, there's a reason. Now, when we apply this to the problem of divine actions and the problem of divine commands, this is why I think our version of the problem of animal suffering is so much stronger. um, we see that God actually gives reasons for what he's doing. And as you said in the Exodus, it's very, very clear that the reason is to show off his power. He says it explicitly in the text. So you'd have to deny the text to sort of wiggle out of that one. But Exodus is a hard one to deny. I can see someone saying, well, the flood wasn't meant to be taken literally. But the Exodus is very foundational in the story of Judaism. And of course, Jesus mentions it. He has the Last Supper, which was the Pesach, to recount the story of the Exodus. So they're really going to struggle to say that's metaphorical. Um, but yet here God is giving us his reasons. So the skeptical theist, then, who is also a believer of the Bible, is going to struggle now because he's given the reasons. You can't say, "Oh, I don't know the reason why he made all those animals suffer." Or I mean, I guess you could steal appeal to some unknown reason. But the point is, at least there is a reason given, and it looks like a illegitimate reason because why God could have showed off his power in ways that made animals suffer less. He could have moved the stars around. He could have created fire in the sky. He could have written a message on the moon or so. Who knows? That you look up and you see text or
He could have just not hardened Pharaoh's frickin' heart.
yeah. Why did God put in his heart?
Yeah,
So that he had the opportunity to show off his powers.
that's it. Like, it's clear his intentions were to destroy and damage and harm those people who are idolaters and aren't the worshipers of him. And we see this in, you can go cross-culturally to the ancient Near East or really anywhere and find the competitive nature of deities, and they're kind of this patriarchal system where they're competing against other factions, other cults, other gods. He walks and talks and acts similar to them and how they behave and compete against other deities and stuff. So it's a very human construct. There's a scholar who wrote a philosophical PhD thesis that I did a documentary on, very long video. It was like 4.5 hours because I took his entire paper and made it into a movie on YouTube. Um, it's Jaco Garike from South Africa, and he he said it was so controversial that a lot of the scholars who were looking at it, you could tell were not, he was blunt, like very straight to the point. And he goes through so many things, like philosophers think of things that most people don't actually try to think about. It's stuff like you brought it up in some of your videos. I've seen you talk about the heavens are actually hard, solid. To
Oh, yeah,
hold up.
this is something I've emphasized a lot in debates. Like, this is something you could you could believe maybe that the days don't mean days, But you can't believe that the solid dome of the sky that's mentioned in Genesis is not something that the authors believed in. There's no question that they believed in that, and the evidence for that is absolutely overwhelming.
He gets into other things that are very interesting, like, this is a storm deity. Some of the attributes of him describe certain geological implications that, show that what would like, how would this god be depicted if they were riding in Siberia or if they were riding in a different environment? Or even his political setup, the way that God is described is very much in him being a king with surrounded by a council is very much like an ancient Near Eastern, Mesopotamian, Egyptian king with a council. Like the reflection of God is actually very anthropomorphized like the man on earth. And in every single way, almost every single thing you can look at biblically that pertains to God is so reflective of the human on earth that when you walk away, not only is Yahweh contradictory with Yahweh amongst the scriptures that you're reading, but it's so anthropomorphic, you can't, it's almost like you realize very clearly this is a man-made image of an ancient Near Eastern deity. So you get these Christians later that are doing exactly what Greeks got guilty of doing by metaphorizing and finding ways to make the language, well, he's not a male. They use male pronouns, but let's discuss this. He's not a male. Yeah, he did have a wife named Asherah, but that was a false cult version of him. He wasn't really a man who had a wife. Like he's not a God is not a man of war, as the Bible says. Um, but just coming back to your point about animal suffering, because I was recalling an interesting scene when I was a young teen in high school and I was really reading my Bible, like, I was there reading it. King James Bible, I was a King James onlyist at that time. I grew out of that over time, and I remember reading a moment when I got to Solomon, and Solomon had the wisest man on earth. He had a dream one night, and God comes to him and says, "Okay, what do you want? Death of your enemies? All the money in the world? What do you want?" And he goes, "I just want wisdom." And I was like, "Whoa." And then God goes, "You know, because you only ask for wisdom, I'll give you the death of your enemies. I'll give you the money. I'll give you everything you ever asked for and wisdom." The next day or even that night, he wakes up. I can't remember if it was the night or the next day. He goes to a high place and he sacrifices the number of animals that are described in that account that get killed all in one sitting till he's exhausted practically and can't do it anymore, according to the story, is so many animals. You have to think to yourself, would God even like, why is that even necessary? What does he need all of those animals to be killed for? It just doesn't, when we think about it like we're thinking now, it makes no sense why we would need that or why a God would need that many animal sacrifices or any really at all.
Yeah, I mean, just think of the terror that those animals are gonna go through if they've been brought to this place. You know, they will probably know what's coming. Um, it's horrendous just to think about. I mean, it's funny because one of the justifications for the Canaanite slaughter that Christians often give is that, well, they sacrificed children, human children. Um, Now put aside the fact that I think there's evidence that the Israelites did the same. But, why is all this animal sacrifice okay? You know, don't they, deserve, some respect for their lives and their suffering? Maybe it's not as bad as a human sacrifice, but it's still bad. Like, you can't argue what good comes of it. If you might think, well, maybe we have to eat meat, and so we'll allow killing of animals for that purpose. I mean, we can debate that. I don't think that's true, but you can have that debate. But what possible purpose could it serve for these animals to be slaughtered for sacrifice for God? I mean, to me, it's horrific.
It's clear that the version of God that gets falsified in this, at bare minimum, is this very heightened theological deity that Christians have. Now, if they want to go back to an archaic model, an anthropomorphized deity, if they want to go back to a God who really is the author of evil and good, in some way that he's doing both. He's not omnibenevolent. He's not all loving. He loves, but he also hates. He has a vicious side. He has a happy side, like the way he's described by these ancient texts. Go for it. And I don't know if you read the book Francesca Stavrakopoulos wrote called God and Anatomy.
Yeah, I have, yeah, yeah.
I loved the last chapter because she goes into, in a fun way, it's almost like she's an anthropologist or she's doing some she's like digging up the bones of God through the text. And she's like, all right, we're gonna look at the femur, we're gonna look at this, we're gonna look at that, his face, his head, the skull. Like we're like looking at the anatomy of God like a fossil. And in the intro, she's like, I'm very disappointed on what we've done to God, or how we've like philosophized him out of the way from what the ancient version of what he looked like. Um, and then at the end, she does the eulogy of God. God is dead. She does kind of a Nietzschean type of thing where she's like, God is dead and you've killed him. Not the atheist. You believers have killed him. You have taken and philosophized and buried him beneath. You completely theologized him out of the way, and now you have replaced him with Plato, some Neoplatonic form of a deity that is completely unfalsifiable. If he used to be behind the clouds, he's now outside of space and time. If you know, in every single respect, you have made him more unfalsifiable, more improve. Like you could never substantiate this deity, and eventually, if we ever were, and I don't think it'll ever happen, but imagine we were able to make it. Somehow we had science that helped us penetrate beyond space and time. And we go, well, he's not there. Actually, ladies and gentlemen, God is actually, and they'll find another way to make it something else.
Yeah, I mean, my guess as to what happened in history, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, is that the ancient, Hebrews believed that God was a physical being, like he had a body. And then what happened was when Greece and Rome spread their ideas, the Platonic ideas sort of became predominant, or maybe not predominant, but at least influential enough that some Hellenized Jews took this view of God as something more abstract, something more like the Platonic ideal form. Whereas the earlier view was just, no, God is like a Marvel superhero character. Um, so so that explains why you've got these sort of 2 different gods, if you like, the physical God, and I think that would explain why it says we're made in his image, because we literally look like him. That's what I think made in his image means. But then, of course, later Christians don't think that. They're like, "Oh, no, it means, we have his essence." But, obviously we don't have his perfection, right? So which essence are we talking about? And then the relevance again to this debate is that a lot of Christians, when they talk about the moral argument or why they think they can lay the foundations of morality on Christianity, is they say, well, what the Imago Dei means, what the image of God, that phrase, what it means is that, we have moral worth or something like that. We have consciousness or we have free will or, some property that gives, and that's what gives us our moral worth. And they say to the atheist, without this Imago Dei, you can't ground moral worth. But when we start to think about animals, well, apparently they're not made in the Imago Dei. So it would their whole supposed rationale for grounding moral concern would imply animals don't have moral concern, because they're apparently not made in the Imago Dei. So they get unstuck there too when you bring animals into the equation. So in many, many ways, this new sort of science that's showing us, I think, that animals are sentient beings and they have pain, they can suffer. It's really tripping up the Christian on so many fronts, both in terms of this argument that we have, expanded from animal suffering, but also when they start to reflect on what's their grounding for moral concern for humans.
It's interesting, their own biblical corpus in Deuteronomy, and I can't remember the chapter right now. Joshua Bowen remembers these things like off the top of his head. He brought this up in a discussion with me about the image of God. What do they mean by image of God? They don't mean what you and me mean, we look like God. The people of this particular uh, nation are really made in the image of God, or if you will, people in general, because I think there's a universal image. It's an ideological myth that mankind is made to look like the deity. They have the same shape, they have the same kind of look, if you will, to this God. They want to make it about like attribute or worth, that we're made in the image of God and we have all this worth. And when you go to Deuteronomy, you find these passage where you have a bull, like if an owner of a bull, the bull ends up uh, killing, really somehow stampede or bores and kills a free man. The owner of that bull, I think if the bull's had a past experience, I can't remember the exact text of what it is, but you have to put that owner to death because they that's a free man. If your bull, uh, pierces and kills a slave, which should also be carrying the same image of God as the free man, which would mean all mankind is created equal in the image of God, correct? Well, in that case, you just have to pay a few shekels, 30 shekels, and then you're off the hook. So if we're talking image of God has the same exact across the board, humans are inherently important morally, intrinsically in the image of God and should be treated the same. Your entire book falsifies that in so many different respects, and it's not just slavery that shows us with an animal that actually bores the free man versus the slave person, and how you treat those people are completely different against the in the law code of how that is supposed to enact itself. And I think you're right. I think what happened as Francesca tries to paint it with God's body is you have an anthropomorphic God who shows up, who walks, who talks, who's literally doing these very human-like things on Earth in presence of other humans. Eventually, her argument is post-Babylon, once you have this kind of heightened view of deity, maybe due to Persian Zoroastrianism influencing this idea, they start to insert a character named the Angel of the Lord. And it may be due to a redactor later, it might be early Hellenistic period when some of this stuff's being inserted. I don't know the answer to this question, way above my pay grade, but experts are debating these things. And what happens is this angel of the Lord becomes a like a mediator, so to speak, representative, and that God himself is actually up there in heaven away from, so he distances himself from mankind and usually has like an emanation or a mediator figure or some type of representation of himself and not himself. And so what ends up happening is he plays hide and go seek for so long that eventually Platonic ideas and such start to impact and go, actually, they always thought he had a form. Even later in Judaism, the Zohar and all these texts still imply God has a body. It's just way away from humanity and it can't be accessed. Um,
Well, there's a passage in Isaiah where it says God looks down on the circle of the earth and the people appear like grasshoppers. Now, he can only do that can only be true if he's high up, right? Because if you're high up and you look down, people look small, okay? If you are, omnipresent, why on earth would they look small? You see everything, you know? But if you're localized, if you have a body and you're high up in the sky, then that passage makes absolutely perfect sense. But it makes absolutely no sense if he's omnipresent. So I, I think that passage is probably earlier than these Hellenistic ideas, that are the ideas that came from the Greeks about the perfect forms. And you can see that evolution. And in fact, just before Christ, we have Philo, the Jewish Hellenistic philosopher. And my understanding of Philo is that he says, yeah, God needs a mediator between God and man. And he calls this mediator, you know what he calls him?
Logos.
Yeah, exactly. Right. So you can see,
Yeah, inspired from the Greeks, but
yeah. So to me, yeah, you can see the evolution of the religion. It's clear as day in my, in my opinion.
no doubt. So we got off a little bit from the suffering. Again, at the end of the day, the question then, as you're putting the bow on this whole picture, what does all of this do to the idea of God's existence in your view? And I guess dealing with, does this falsify God? What kind of God does this falsify? Or what kind of gods, plural, would this falsify? Where would they have to navigate to next in order to still hold to a theistic view?
So I think our argument is targeted at the Judeo-Christian God. So I think it's very strong evidence against the Judeo-Christian God, and
Would
so
that include Islam?
just to some extent, because now some of the arguments that we use would apply to the Islamic God. Some of them may or may not. So, for example, it depends if you're a Muslim, what do you think of a particular biblical text? Do you think they're real or not real? Do they have an opinion as to whether Jesus exorcised 2,000 demons into, sorry, the exorcised the demons into 2,000 pigs? I don't know what the Muslim opinion on that story is. I don't know what their opinion is on, some of the other incidents that we've described, the cruelty to the Bible. Nevertheless, the problem of creation, the problem of time is not specific to a particular text. So that would be true of any omni God. And I think most people, well, I don't know about most people, certainly the people that I encounter, when they talk about God, they mean an omni God or they mean the God of the Bible. So those are the two sort of, this is the problem that when you talk about God, the term God can mean so many different things that you really need to pin down what you mean by God when you talk about God. So usually if I was to do a debate, does God exist? I'd be like, well, which God are we talking about? You know, when we debated the Connectleys, Alex O'Connor and I was pretty insistent we're debating because what had been suggested to me by modern day debate was, which is where we had the debate, was so let's debate whether God exists. And I said, no, let's debate whether the biblical God exists because you could, there are some people, pantheists that use the phrase God to just mean nature. God is just equal to nature. Most people who are atheists don't think nature doesn't exist, right? Uh, so the term, and in fact, I think Cameron Bertuzzi on Capturing Christianity is like, atheism doesn't make, it's silly. It doesn't make sense because you can't prove every God doesn't exist, and there could be so many different definitions of God. Like, so the problem of suffering, the best argument against God doesn't even disprove God because we could just say God is not omnipotent or not omniscient or whatever, the problem is, yeah, you can do that. You could change the definition of God or use a different definition of God to avoid this problem. But then your theory will often become not so much wrong, but maybe not even wrong. So not even wrong is it's a term used in physics, and people that know my channel will know I've got a lot of material on physics. I interviewed Stephen Hawking and various cosmologists, and I have a book coming out, The Battle of the Big Bang, about different models of cosmology. But this phrase, not even wrong, is used in physics, and it's basically an insult to an idea, as if to say, it's even worse than being wrong. It's so meaningless that it's not even wrong. You know, it's just gibberish. So that was Wolfgang Pauli. He said, "Your ideas are so, they're so bad they're not even wrong." Um, and that's what can happen to God. Like if you make that definition so vague, so slippery, that your theory maybe it wouldn't be like the problem of animal suffering would say, "Oh, well, your theory's wrong." Right, rather, you've made the definition of God so slippery that it's not even wrong, which is even worse.
That's what I'm saying, like, when people it's almost like Jordan Peterson. When Jordan Peterson is debating, I remember him saying to who did he say this to? If it was to what either Richard Dawkins, it might have even been to Alex, I can't remember somebody, he's like, in a debate, and it might have I can't remember the debate, you might remember where he's like, pretty much, "God is whatever you most desire and wanted," and it's like, if the word God can just be meaning different, like, I desire to be a millionaire one day, that is my God. If that is what you mean by God is like a desire or want or something I try to aspire for, and that becomes my God, or I aspire for this cup of coffee, so at this moment, this cup of coffee is my God, you've lost any what the hell are we talking about anymore? Like, your point is this, and I kind of thought when you go into discussing and defining God for people like Cameron or anyone who's trying to do this mushy gushy redefinition, it can mean almost anything. Um, how would you define God to someone like that before you even carry on the conversation so that we have an understanding? Because, like you said, if nature is God, then there's no difference between you being a theistic kind of person who thinks nature itself is God and being atheistic would me saying naturalism's the case and I don't believe there's a God. But if you define God that way, I guess I'm a theist at that point because I now think nature exists and I think that, naturalism makes no sense. You know what I mean?
Yeah, well, people have accused pantheists of just being atheists with a different name, you know? And in fact, Einstein famously, said he wasn't an atheist, right? Um, but yet when he asked, "Well, what kind of God do you believe in?" He says, "Well, not a personal God," you know, Spinoza's God. But most people understand the term God to be a personal being, I think, or at least in our culture. Um, so if you deny that, then I would say you are an atheist. But of course, these terms are slippery. But my advice to the atheist doing a debate is to pin down which God we're talking about. So if you debate a Christian, does the Christian God exist? Because otherwise, you can just slip out of any claim being made with your slippery definition of God. And debate the God that your interlocutor believes in. You're right. That is what you should do, because these terms about does God exist, if the phrase God can mean anything, then the whole conversation is just pointless.
Exactly. Look, ladies and gentlemen, Phil Halper, I hope is that correct? Did I get it right that time?
Yeah.
Halper. I hope you'll go subscribe to his YouTube channel. I seriously do. The link is in the description. Are there any final words from you? I know there's so much more we can do, and I really want to have this conversation again with you. We can go into different topics, of course.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, I should just point out that, if you want this sort of in-depth discussion, on our YouTube channel, where I have the philosophers Alex Malpass and Dan Liffer. We're doing a regular show. It's called the Sci-Fi Show, and it stands for science and philosophy. And, it's where we're trying to do is deal where science and philosophy interact with each other, particularly with regards to philosophy of religion. So, like, in this case, in the animal suffering case, we're talking about the neuroscience of pain, and it might seem like very specific sciencey stuff, but of course, it has huge philosophical implications, because if it's true that animals don't feel pain, then the Christian could be off the hook, you know? So we tackle these sorts of topics, and, it might be about whether the universe had a beginning, it might be about all kinds of different, areas where these themes intersect. And, yeah, check us out.
So many questions come to my mind. I know Alex wanted he did become vegan for a while. And what are the implications once you start seeing this as true and it actually is happening? How does that change one's behavior, or what then should someone do to modify or try to harm reduction kind of approach to the world we live in? There's so many implications of this, and if you just accept the Christian message, this gets back to that famous old constant regurgitated argument that I hear Ruslan inspiring philosophy. Christianity has only improved and helped society, and I don't know how factual the statistics are about what that means, but the implications of this, if going toward a mass extinction of animals in an unbelievable fashion, with your worldview actually seeing sacrifice of animals, and then, of course, once you made your single chief dude named Jesus your sacrifice, you still then can treat animals however, because they have this idea they don't have a soul, they don't feel pain, and you keep eating your burgers and your sandwiches and your whatever. Um, what what in the world does that do? How like there's
Right, so
so many.
actually, I should point out that one argument I've been trying to push recently is, if you like, an argument for climate change against God. So, and here it goes back to the Genesis text. So my kind of hypothesis, is that, the Genesis text is not scientifically accurate, and that has two consequences. One, it pushes potential atheists away from the religion, because some of them will say, well, this text was obviously written not by God, so I'm not going to follow this religion. But what it also does is that those who take the text literally will be pushed away from science, and they will distrust scientists. And so now, if that's true, then we shouldn't be surprised that when climate change comes, to the forefront of the conversation, many, not all, but many will say, I don't trust scientists, so I'm going to ignore the threat of climate change. And what we see, what I pointed out, is that survey data shows that 90% of atheists accept climate science, whereas only about 45% of Christians do, and only about a third of evangelicals do. And that maps pretty strongly to the evolution case. So again, about 90% of atheists accept evolution, and the numbers get lower and lower depending on, general Christian to evangelical Christian. So to me, then, if that's true, then this could be the most like horrific legacy of Christianity, because it doesn't take a lot of votes to swing between Kamala Harris, who might do something about the climate crisis, or at least not make it worse, to Donald Trump, whose message is drill, baby, drill. Let's dig up as much coal as we can. Um, and that will have huge implications to the fate of life on this planet. And it only takes a few million, or maybe even less than a few million votes. I mean, what was it, like 2 million votes between Harris and Trump, something like that? And then maybe less in the swing states. I don't know. I know that in the absolute votes, I think it was about 2 million. Um, and if now imagine that God had made the text not have so many scientific errors. He could have guided the text. So, it might have maybe mentioned something like evolution. He could have done it vaguely or something like he could have said, "I created all the creatures and they descended from each other and changed gradually." You know, um, if imagine that he'd made it scientifically accurate, there might be less reaction, less distrust of science from Christian evangelicals, and maybe they might accept climate change. Now, I'm not claiming that the only reason we're not doing anything about climate change is because of Christian theology and evangelical distrust of science. Clearly, there are many factors involved, but it's one of them, and this could be the most horrific legacy of Christianity, I think.
Ladies and gentlemen, go subscribe to Phil. Thank you for your time, my friend.
Thanks, Eric. It's been great.
Never forget, we are MythVision.